to join us today. We are excited to do a few things in our time together. As the Executive Director of Leading on Opportunity, I am thrilled to support Tonya Jameson as she begins to educate the community on the childcare crisis and its impact on workforce. So today what we'll do is we'll talk through how we got to this point, what we could do moving forward, and specifically our hope is that those who identify as a part of the business community will walk away with a newfound understanding of the childcare crisis and what you all can do to support us. I want to make sure to thank all of the participants for joining us today as panelists. And if you have questions, please make sure to put them into the chat. Another member of our team will be monitoring those questions, so we'll make sure we get them answered. And then finally, before we leave today, we'll have one or two questions that we want you to answer for your feedback. I'll now hand it off to Joe Bost, who serves as the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Charlotte Business Alliance.
Thank you, Sherry. It's great to be here this afternoon. Again, my name is Joe Bost. I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer at the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance, and I really appreciate the opportunity to welcome you today as we discuss the important topic of childcare and frankly, why it needs to be a business community priority. As a parent of two young children who are 6 and 20 months, my wife and I know firsthand the challenges that working parents are facing. I want to give a shout out to Leading on Opportunity, the Charlotte Executive Leadership Council, NC Child, the NC Chamber, and all the other groups working collectively to advance this important issue. Look, the Charlotte region's economy is strong. We have a total workforce of 1.6 million people and a regional GDP of over $239 billion. There's no question we live, work, and play in a great region. Now, at the CLT Alliance, we constantly hear from our investors about their need for workers. This cuts across industries, levels of experience, size of employer, and look, the fact is this, everyone needs workers. In our investor survey that we conducted last year to help formulate our legislative agenda, 80% of our investors said education and workforce was a top issue. Investors said the leading issue, which is having the greatest impact on their business, is the workforce shortage. It's safe to say workforce is on the minds of employers, indeed top of mind for any. So the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance legislative agenda, as part of it, has a focus on making sure the childcare ecosystem is responsive to the needs of employers and the workforce. Today, you'll hear a lot about what is being done to address the needs of the employers, providers, and parents who are all struggling with access to childcare and the cost of providing, and for parents using childcare services. For the Charlotte region to continue to grow, we need to add more workers to the talent pool. Making childcare more accessible and affordable is one way to get more workers in the talent pool. Just as the CLT Alliance works to keep a strong business climate, including a competitive tax climate, and ensure our transportation and infrastructure is well maintained, we also need to make sure childcare is accessible and affordable. Now, as I wrap up, I'd like to thank leaders in the North Carolina General Assembly for their openness to have these conversations with the business community and all the other advocates on this important issue. I believe that strong coalitions focused on achieving outcomes and building consensus will lead us all to the success we're looking for. And on behalf of the business community, I'm excited for what we can accomplish together. I look forward to the conversation today and certainly appreciate all the interest that this webinar has garnered. So now I have the pleasure of turning the floor over to Don Jonas with Atrium Health. Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate it. And thanks to all the organizers for pulling this together. And thanks for all of you for joining us for this conversation. I was invited to give a couple minutes on this issue and why it's so important to Atrium Health and why it's really important to the healthcare sector, but also why it's important to the overall economy in North Carolina and indeed in our country. The next slide. So it should be a business priority for childcare advocacy. And so the work that my team does, I'm Assistant Vice President for Social Strategy and Impact with Atrium Health. And we have a for-all mission, and the work that we do goes beyond the hospital clinic walls. And we spend a lot of time on trying to get folks access to care. We want to provide affordable housing opportunities for our patients and for the communities we serve. Food security and access to food is really important. Employment, career development really matters. But affordable access to high quality childcare is absolutely essential to our workforce. If you go to the next slide, you'll see when it comes up, we have a range of different things that we do for all of our teammates, and whether it's educational assistance or academic advising, on-site care clinics. One piece we do is a dependent backup care, which is, I think, a wonderful service where folks can have 15 days a year where they can care for a loved one, could be a child, could be an elderly person, and includes access to extensive resources on where to go for assistance. But that doesn't get to the longer sort of structural challenge that our teammates have, and that I know is part of the reason we're having this conversation here today, is that providing affordable, accessible, long-term childcare options remains. And unfortunately, we're in a crisis situation. It's not getting better, and it could get worse. If you look on the next slide, we have over 1,000 different care locations all over the state, urban and rural settings. And we have a wide range of teammate childcare needs. About 80% of our population are women, and many of those women and their families, they have childcare needs. What we've realized is there's really not a one-size-fits-all single solution that we can offer to all of our teammates. But we know that the greatest need is to strengthen and expand childcare provider options across North Carolina. I've had some conversations with our HR leaders over the last few days and last week as I was preparing for this, and I kept hearing challenges around folks that were not taking jobs because they didn't have access to childcare, others that were leaving the workforce because they couldn't get access to childcare. We are a supporter of the NC House Bill 342. I put a quote here from Dr. Keneal Coltman, our Chief Social Impact Officer. Without adequate access to quality childcare, an already fragile healthcare workforce will be further stressed. We think this should be a priority. We're hopeful that there are other business leaders and business organizations across the state that would come together to advocate for this. We know that with the loss of some of these funds that are going to happen at the end of this calendar year, not only will it impact the ability to have the bricks and mortar to have affordable places to go, it'll also impact the ability to pay for the folks that are working in these childcare centers. So we're all in on this and want to support it and recognize we can't do it alone. We really need to do this with our partners. And I'm delighted that we are a part of this. And I'm extra happy that we're having this conversation that hopefully will galvanize some interest in doing this kind of work more effectively across the state. So with that, I'll pass it over to Elizabeth Byrum with NC Child on an overview of childcare funding.
Thank you so much, John. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you all. Erica Palmer-Smith, I'm filling in for her. She sends her regards. She was unfortunately in a minor fender bender. She is fine. Everyone is fine. But I am pinch hitting for her today. But just grateful for this conversation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at sort of with childcare funding in North Carolina. We would be remiss to not take a moment just to thank our members of the North Carolina General Assembly and the Health and Human Service Department folks, particularly the Division of Childcare, Child Development and Early Education, for really allowing us to sustain our system throughout the COVID pandemic. We know that there's more work to be done, but many of the relief funds were essential in keeping local providers afloat and keeping families with options for childcare. So we are grateful for that, and particularly to all of our providers and teachers on the front lines supporting families. We also know that there is a history of not having enough investment in childcare in North Carolina well before the pandemic. Our state was not matching the investments that we believe are crucial to support the brain and developmental science findings that make the case for investing in young children and early education. We know that brains are not born, they're built. It's a common phrase in the early education field. And a lot of that comes to the proper investment to make sure we have a robust childcare system that meets the needs of young children and families across our state, across all communities. Our system is also very diverse. We have a lot of different options for families and lots of different programs. Many are subsidized to support families to be able to afford them. This includes NC PreK, a variety of early education opportunities and centers or in family childcare homes. We also have early intervention services, and we also have the subsidy system, which allows families to have more affordable care and then additionally Head Start and Smart Start. So we have a very robust system. I'm happy to share some information that NC Child has put together about that. We also know that childcare subsidy, also known as vouchers, is one of the largest funding sources for our early childhood system. It blends both federal and state dollars to help families afford care, allowing families to pay just a portion of the cost of that childcare. Right now, NC Child has been doing a lot of work on the subsidy market rate, which is the reimbursement rate at which providers receive funds to pay for those voucher slots. And right now, it's a very outdated rate that we're working to get updated to reflect the true cost and value of high quality early education. So this slide just shows us kind of, despite all I just mentioned, we're still on sort of a plateau in terms of our funding to make sure that all families have access to these services. Next slide, please. Who pays for childcare in North Carolina? I've sort of alluded to it with the fact that we've seen minimal increases in our funding, sort of from the state as well as from the federal government. And so parents are still shouldering the majority of the cost of childcare. And I know there are many parents in this Zoom room right now, and that is a very hefty cost. We have a graphic on the next slide. You can go ahead and go to that. That childcare really costs as much as college tuition right now in North Carolina. I've told people, if your children end up going to college, you're sort of paying for that twice in their life. That's 8 to 10 years for one child, and if you have multiple children, sort of multiplying that out. It is very close to annual mortgage payments. And so it makes it really difficult for families to be able to choose high quality care when they also have to make decisions about affording their rent or mortgage payment or making sure that their family has other basic needs. And it's really out of reach for a lot of families, not just our families that are low income, but many middle income families as well struggle to pay for childcare in North Carolina. And right now, we also know that a lot of the programs that provide subsidized care are not fully funded to serve all eligible children. So we have many families who might qualify, but are not able to access that because of wait lists, because of lack of availability in their community for them to find that care. Next slide, please. And so for my final slide, just talking a little bit more about the workforce, which we've heard from our speakers prior, is a really critical part of childcare. I've had conversations with folks that, children really grow and develop in the community and kind of in relationship with caring, nurturing adults. This is not something that can be really automated. We need adults in classrooms to help build those brains. And so that means we need teachers in our classrooms that really, we don't have teachers. That really affects a program's ability to stay open, to serve more families. We also know that for many, many years, teachers in the childcare system have been underpaid for the really important brain building work that they're doing. We've had fewer people entering the field. We've had highly qualified teachers leaving the field because of the low compensation rates. Right now, most childcare staff on average, and in many communities it's much lower, are making $12 an hour or less for the really important work that they're doing to prepare the next generation. And many do not have benefits either, like healthcare or retirement. And so we're really seeing this being a huge problem, that even if we fix some of the investments, if we're not investing in the workforce behind the workforce, we're really going to continue to see the exacerbation of the crisis in the childcare system. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Janet Singerman, the president of Childcare Resources, Inc., to talk a little bit more about the stabilization grants and how they impacted the Charlotte region.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to all of you for being here today. It's so good to see so many of you here to talk about an issue about which I am passionate, childcare and the needs of the childcare system. It's been more than 40 years since Childcare Resources opened its doors to create and advance access to high quality childcare for all those who rely on it: children, families, employers, and communities. CCRI is the region's quarterback organization for all things related to early care and education, childcare, school-age childcare as well. And before I go a step further, I want to really recognize Jake House and Mike Blackwelder of Smart Start and Devanya Govan Hunt of National Black Child Development Institute's Charlotte chapter for the work that those two organizations doing, the incredible work they're doing also to advance access to quality early learning for all children and families who rely on it. CCRI is based in Charlotte, but we directly serve Mecklenburg, Union, Cabarrus, Rowan, and Stanley counties. So we're regional in nature. And we also provide several services statewide. I'm here to, again, like Elizabeth, talk to you about the inadequately financed childcare system. Childcare's revenue base primarily relies on what parents in their early earning years can afford to pay for childcare while still realizing an economic gain from employment. This financial equation has always made it really challenging to operate childcare while offering decent wages to those who deliver it. And you just heard Elizabeth say early educators in family childcare homes and childcare centers across our region were typically earning about $10 to $12 an hour prior to the pandemic. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but I'll get to those numbers. So even before the pandemic, parents couldn't afford to pay more for childcare. Childcare professionals could not afford to earn less. And childcare program operators, some of whom are on the screen today, could not charge more for their services and remain in business. But during the pandemic, fluctuating and reduced child enrollment, increased operating costs, and increased staffing costs further threatened the economic viability of childcare and really laid bare the inadequate financing within which childcare programs have had to operate. Still, this childcare system, locally, regionally, and across our state, persevered and remained open. Childcare was finally recognized as essential, and childcare professionals were recognized as both heroes and, as Elizabeth said, the workforce behind the workforce. To stabilize the childcare industry and to enable parents to keep working and the economy to recover, the federal government quadrupled its investment in North Carolina's childcare system to $1.3 billion from its pre-pandemic $333 million annual funding level. North Carolina's Division of Child Development implemented myriad strategies to help the childcare system survive. And these strategies were incredibly successful. And now to this slide, as a result, most of our regions and states' childcare systems survived the pandemic. We were really concerned about this at the onset of the pandemic. We did lose programs, but not as many programs and childcare spaces and staff as we anticipated. So you see these regional demographics down about 7% in childcare spaces, down about 6% in childcare staff, and in Mecklenburg, about 8% in overall spaces and about 4% in staff. So we suffered losses, but not as dire losses as we anticipated at the onset of the pandemic. And so how did we avoid the larger loss? Well, I frankly believe it was due to the incredible commitment of childcare owners and operators and classroom teachers, the entire childcare workforce, and in particular, due to North Carolina's Childcare Stabilization Grants, which were funded primarily with federal American Rescue Plan monies. All licensed childcare programs could apply for stabilization grants to help with fixed and family costs, and these were called fixed cost grants, and to provide increased staff salaries and or benefits for those who work in family childcare homes and childcare centers, and these were called compensation grants. Since October of 21, the stabilization grants have enabled childcare programs to recover losses and increased operational expenses that were incurred during the pandemic, and enabled the industry to raise wages by, in this region, about $2 to $3 per hour, which is significant given the pre-pandemic wage of $10 to $12 an hour. The stabilization grants have had an incredible impact on staff retention, recruitment, and equity for a workforce that is predominantly comprised of women of color. Put another way, the Child Care Stabilization Grants Program has been a critical economic stimulus package supporting childcare program recovery and supporting our state's economic recovery. So if you go to the next slide. In Mecklenburg County and this region, stabilization grant monies distributed year to date have totaled $154 million. In Mecklenburg alone, it's about $106.6 million. So that's the good news. We had this tremendous influx of funding to help stabilize the industry during a time of incredible need and increased expense. The issue is at hand is really what happens when the stabilization grants end. The first fixed cost component has already ended, but the compensation component, which is really buttressing the earnings of the childcare workforce and underpinning the economic viability of the childcare staff. This component, which is about $300 million statewide, will end in December of 2023. And it ends really at a time when childcare is facing unprecedented wage inflation beyond its doors. Those working in childcare can now easily earn more for themselves and their families by flipping hamburgers, serving fast food, working in a big box store, or being a garbage collector. So what's at stake with the end of stabilization grants? I really actually think it's nothing short of the continued availability of a skilled childcare workforce and the continued economic viability of childcare. Many, many early educators will not be able to afford to go back to pre-pandemic wages, given significantly increased costs of living, and will not have to go back to these wages, given the abundance of higher paying job opportunities that require less higher education and less responsibility than educating young children in childcare. When compensation grants go away, it is likely that more childcare teachers will leave the field. And as childcare shortages result and intensify, the availability of childcare spaces will contract, and the impact will be felt by working parents across all trades as access to childcare becomes more limited. Ultimately, economic recovery will be further impacted. So I guess I want to say a huge amount is at stake. In the next week, the North Carolina Child Care Resource and Referral Council, which CCRI co-leads, will be releasing the results of a statewide survey that we commissioned to learn the concerns of child care program operators regarding the end of stabilization grants, and in particular, the compensation grants. I want to close by sharing the words of one of the thousands of responses we've received from North Carolina child care providers. And I quote, "The stabilization grants and compensation and bonus grants have been very helpful to my staff and me. However, when the grants end and we do not get further funding, I look for my staff to walk out the door because I will have to cut their pay, benefits, and bonuses. It's a different world out here from what we were dealing with before COVID. Our groceries are much higher, lights and water bills have increased. It will be hard to survive after compensation grants end. I will have to increase parent fees, and these parents are paying all they can already." So with that, I want to pass the program on to Tim Gibbons, who is Program Manager for Early Childhood Education Initiatives for Mecklenburg County.
Thank you, Janet, and thanks to everybody for giving me an opportunity to speak today, and for listening in on a topic that's really critical for us here at the county. Excuse me. So where I'd like to start is just a brief overview, talking not just about PreK, but talking about sort of the whole PreK ecosystem here in Mecklenburg County, if we want to jump ahead to the next slide. And looking at PreK, because, you know, when we talk about the whole early care ecosystem, it goes beyond just childcare, but also it's critical because our PreK program and our NC PreK programs, those classrooms are located primarily in childcare centers. So this is all interconnected. So I do want to thank again our partners at Smart Start, who administer the PreK program, our partners at CMS, who administer Bright Beginnings and NC PreK, and of course all our PreK providers who are heavily involved in this. And what we've seen this year across these three programs is we've reached all-time enrollments. At some points, over 6,000 children enrolled in just these three public pre-K programs. But you can also see we have vacancies across them, which present some significant challenges. Now, some of those aren't really pertinent to today's conversation, which are programmatic challenges and other things that we're working on as partners in the community. But more relevant to today, going back to Janet's comments, are the challenges that we're seeing in staffing in the pre-K space. And it really limits the ability to actually fully enroll within our programs. So one, we see that within our classrooms with just teachers, lead teachers, but especially assistant teachers and even substitute teachers. And when we can't staff those classrooms, it makes it very challenging to fully enroll in those classrooms or operate them on the proper schedule as so much staff churns through there. The other big piece we're seeing this year that limits families' ability to enroll in these programs is actually aftercare staffing. So while these are full day programs, full day for pre-K is 6.5 hours. So when we talk about programs that may run from 8 to 2:30, we have a lot of families that want to enroll or stay enrolled, but if they can't find aftercare, they can't afford to come pick their child up at 2:30. So while the county has made investments, for example, in MEC pre-K to actually cover the costs of aftercare, the demand is there, the need is there, but the staffing and the spaces aren't there. And so we're seeing families have to make some really difficult challenges and make trade-offs in terms of working full hours or a full work schedule or finding a high quality place to put their child and adjusting that schedule. Next slide, please. So one of the big questions that we get is, well, what can we do to incentivize more workers to come into the pipeline, either in the pre-K space or across the whole early childhood continuum? And luckily, the community has stepped up, which predates my time in this role. And through the generosity of the CELC and its partners, and in partnership with the county, the Foundation for the Carolinas, and our local educational institutions, there has been a workforce pipeline initiative that's been ongoing for 3 to 4 years. Incentivized to bring people in and covering full costs of tuition, support services, transportation, childcare, et cetera. And while there's been some major successes with both of these programs and the amazing work that their staff do, what we're starting to see is it's becoming more and more challenging to recruit at the front end of this pipeline. We're hearing from prospective candidates that while this is an amazing opportunity and it's something I'd be interested in, similar to what Janet just referenced, is it really worth my time and effort, even if you're going to fully cover all these costs for me, that if at the end of this journey on this career path, I'm going to make less than I could if I could walk down the street right now to Chipotle or Amazon. So it's a real challenge to get folks to come in on the front end, knowing these compensation challenges that are at the back end. Next slide, please. And beyond just the funding, we've also looked at some really creative opportunities to expand the workforce pipeline. So looking at some alternative ways to expand that pipeline and bring in some other candidate pools. So CPCC, for example, has developed some bilingual educator programming to offer opportunities to folks with Spanish as their primary language. Also looking at some other recruitment pathways. And frankly, still, we have this first order problem that compensation both hinders recruitment and also retention. So even though we may get people into the pipeline and into these positions, if you have continual churn in the field because of the challenges with compensation, really at the end of the day, we're just struggling to keep our heads above water. There's also been a lot of talk about apprenticeship programs, and there's been ongoing development and work with workforce development partners in the community. Which again, a great idea, but what we actually see with most of our pipeline programs is these enrollees are already working in childcare facilities or pre-K classrooms, and they're already getting paid. So again, even though these opportunities are out there, it's still a challenge to bring new people into the pipeline. So I think to wrap up my section here, what I just wanted to highlight was, even though there's been a lot of amazing investments that we've talked about here between the county and in the private sector, by Smart Start as a funder for things like the wages program and stipends, and even just efforts from partners like Smart Start, Janet and her team at CCRI, the Black Child Development Institute with their research and advocacy in this space. This is really a conversation about a wider sustainability issue for the entire ecosystem. So it's not just pre-K, it's not just childcare centers, it's especially our partners who are crucial at our family home care providers and the work that they do. It's childcare subsidy, it's private pay, the business community that we talked about, and most importantly, families. So it's really about sustainability for this ecosystem. So thank you. So I think with that, I am going to pass now over to Rhonda Rivers and Lila Riley to talk about some childcare stories.
Hello, thank you, Tim. And thank you for all that are on this call today, particularly to my provider friends and all the wonderful organizations across the state that are supporting this work that we're doing. My name is Rhonda Rivers. I am the Regional Director of Education for Leaf Spring Schools in North Carolina. Leaf Spring is a nationally accredited preschool with 4 campuses in North Carolina, all of which are in Charlotte and surrounding areas, and they are independently owned. Our 2 campuses in Mecklenburg County staff about 75 teachers, and we serve around 350 families. And just to give you a little background, the remainder of the majority of these families are middle to upper middle class families that work in small business owners, local executives in IT, healthcare, any work that you can imagine, they do it here with the amount of families that we serve. Even with all of the amazing things that we have happening here at Leaf Spring, and in my share today, it's not just about what we're doing at Leaf Spring, but I'm hoping to share some stories that reflects and gives you some insight about what myself as a provider, what we're dealing with boots on the ground, and what some of my other friends that are on this call are experiencing and have experienced and still continue to experience as well. But we have struggled to keep our classrooms staffed over the last 3 years. But with that being said, it was the investment of the stabilization grants that kept our doors open and kept classrooms open and continue to do so with those funds. Under the leadership of Ariel Ford, the director from division, and her amazing team, they have been so tremendously intentional and responsive to our needs. And that's what's kept our programs abreast during the last 3 years. Receiving those stabilization grants allowed us to increase teachers' salaries immediately. In our schools alone, that range was from $2 to $5 an hour. That was just to get teachers in the door, to keep them to the best of our ability so that they didn't all leave us for Chick-fil-A, as my friend said, Chipotle and Amazon. That's real. Those are real numbers. Our commission in North Carolina started to create temporary rules during the pandemic that created more slots for subsidy. So when parents could get back to work, they received more financial support for that. And during this time, that number has increased. That has been life-changing as well. The impact of the pandemic and rising costs in the economy is not just the problem of our childbearing workforce, but it potentially is an indicator and forewarns a crisis beyond what we can imagine if we don't come together from calls like this and work that is being discussed around the state to identify how we continue to plan and execute a plan that can support childcare beyond when this money runs out in December. I want to give you just a couple of quick examples that are real and present and relevant in what we're seeing here at my school and what I'm sure many of my friends on this call have experienced as well. Just last week, there was one day I got a call that 6 teachers in our program called out in one day. And within those 6 teachers, 2 of those teachers were in the same classroom, the same 2-year-old classroom. Let me also add in that 2-year-old classroom that there are 18 kids in that classroom. And that means there are 36 working parents that are represented there. Two of the children in those classrooms are probably on the spectrum, have not been diagnosed, or because of the workforce shortages, they have not been able to receive resources. One of those little girls has been approved to receive a full-time therapist because her needs are so great. But the therapist, because of their shortage in staffing, we're not able to get that support. So that means that technically that one child needs one adult with her full-time. My 2 teachers are still taking care of her with her 17 other peers. As I share with you, I'm watching the screen to make sure that her teacher is okay, to make sure that she receives the support that she needs so that I can make sure that that little girl returns safe to her parents at the end of the day. That's a real problem. Had I not identified and got to work 2 hours early that morning, my husband said to me that morning, and I shared this with someone the other day, he said, Rhonda, I believe that it seems like you are consumed with what's going on today. I said, I have to be consumed. If I don't figure this out really quickly, what will happen is that those 36 parents can't go to work, or at least one of them can't go to work. I'm going to share one more example. There's a parent at our school that is an Atrium healthcare employee, if I'm not mistaken, and she is a pediatric trauma surgeon. On one day, 2 teachers were not able to come to work, and we had to close that infant classroom. She cried in the foyer. And I just want you to imagine what it was like to be a parent on the receiving side of her services and what it would mean what it meant to those parents that she could not get to work today. I just wanted to make that real for you and just to give you an example. So in addition to that, and I'll just wrap it up with saying this, I want you to just consider that the needs of our children are not just having a body in the classroom, but a competent body that can take care of their physical, their mental, their emotional, and their cognitive needs. And that during this pandemic that we have seen the mental and emotional needs of our children and our teachers skyrocket through the door. I just wanted to let you know that mental health crisis that you see on ABC Nightly News doesn't start at age 25. We see it in our preschool classrooms. We need viable, competent, educated workforce. We need good humans with good hearts and mentally stable heads in the classrooms to take care of the children in our community so that the other workforce can get to work and do that with peace and ease, knowing their children are being cared for. So I just ask you to consider what we're dealing with every day to support, to make sure that we hold our legislators responsible for the needs of our community, and for us all to stand together and to execute a plan. We did it during the pandemic. Our crisis is not over. And I know that if we work together, we can continue to do this work that is needed to keep the doors open and provide the needs that families, children, and to keep teachers in the workforce. Thank you so much.
Now we're turning it over to Lila.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lila Riley. I'm offering some perspective as a working parent with a child in daycare, although I know many of who we've already heard from are also working parents, and I see some familiar faces on here, fellow working moms and parents. I want to see if this illustrates. I'd love to ask everyone participating here today to raise their actual hands or virtual hands if they've been impacted or limited in their work capacity in some way by the current state of childcare. And obviously I'm raising my own hand very high. Thank you for participating in that. I know we've already been hearing that this issue has a huge ripple effect across all industries, but I think we have a very strong representative sample here today of who's been impacted. So I'm the mom of a 3.5-year-old and a full-time employee on the corporate side of healthcare. My daughter goes to a daycare center in Charlotte that's been operating for 37 years. It's a no-frills, church-based daycare, but with wonderful, loving teachers and staff. And our director is here today to listen, so I appreciate that. For one child, we pay over $13,000 in tuition annually. And we feel especially lucky to be there, not only because our daughter is thriving, but we're also still on wait lists from when I was pregnant. My employer actually has a daycare center for its employees, but we've been on that wait list for 2.5 years with no movement. And our daycare currently has 42 infants and toddlers on their wait list, which just illustrates that parents have very limited options for quality care for their young children. So recently, our center raised its rates for parents, and as a result of the stabilization grants ending, it had to reduce staff and reduce operating hours to reduce their costs. They laid off 7 employees, and they went from operating on a 6:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. schedule to 7:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. So they shortened their hours of operation by 2 hours. To pick my daughter up by 5 o'clock, my workday ends at 4:30. And that's a really hard deadline to meet every single day. I already felt like I was maxing out the flexibility and accommodation of my leadership at work for when my daughter is homesick, for example, or for when daycare is closed for holidays and other days to give deserving staff time off. Days that I don't automatically have off in my work. And for unexpected closures, like recently we had some needed renovations and a power outage. So it's hard to navigate that. Like most parents, we don't have reliable backup care that we can use on those either expected or unexpected closures. You may hear in my voice today that I've got a cold, but I'm also working today because, as many of you know, moms and parents don't always get to take sick days or to take the time off that they need to. There's too much to get done, and I don't feel like I can miss any more time off of work than is absolutely necessary. Because my husband and I are stretched thin as it is, we're working odd hours whenever we can to get our work done. And that means that we never feel like we get a break. If I were to transition to something else, another role, another industry, another company, I think I'd have a hard time finding the same degree of flexibility, because what I have now is based on trust that I've built over years with my bosses. Or in the alternative, I'd probably be taking a lesser role and a lesser salary. I'm saying this from an incredible place of privilege that many families, many working families just don't have. And it's still incredibly stressful, hard, and constraining. It does not feel sustainable. And so the last point that I want to make is that it's not sustainable for anyone. It's not for parents, but it's not for childcare workers either. No one is winning here. Our center now has less staff. That means less breaks and less flexibility for them too. It means juggling kids from different ages and different classrooms as needed. It means everyone is wearing multiple hats all the time, and morale is low. As a result of the compensation piece of the stabilization grants, some staff got a bump in salary by a couple dollars an hour, as we've already heard. And that's huge, especially when they're not getting benefits and healthcare. So can we really expect them to stay after that grant is over at the end of this year and they're going to be making less money? There's no incentive for them to stay, as we've already been hearing and discussing. And we can't expect them to keep doing more with less, just like we can't keep expecting that of working parents either. So then the ripple effect will be felt even deeper across our economy, and our kids also deserve better. As we just heard from Rhonda, our kids need teachers who want to be there and can be fully present to care and nurture them and handle sometimes special needs. So again, thank you for this opportunity. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over now to Elaine Zuckerman, Advocacy and Communications Director for the North Carolina Early Education Coalition.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's shared such great information today. I really especially want to thank Lila and Rhonda for sharing their personal stories. You know, we talk a lot about the problems that we're facing in the childcare field right now, and those are two great examples of people who are living those problems every single day, along with a lot of other people on this call. So I'm Elaine Zuckerman. I'm with the North Carolina Early Education Coalition. We are the only statewide advocacy organization dedicated solely to improving access to high quality, affordable childcare. Next slide, please. So we've heard a lot about the issues facing childcare right now. You know, as Lila pointed out, it's not sustainable for anybody. The way we finance childcare right now is not working for anybody. It doesn't work for parents, doesn't work for teachers, doesn't work for providers, and it's not working for businesses and communities either. So what I want to do in our last little bit of time here is talk about some solutions and how we can all be involved in pushing this forward. So we believe that we need a multifaceted approach to solving our childcare crisis. Today, I'm just going to kind of focus in on two policies that we think have a lot of potential this legislative session and would make a really big impact. So that's extending the compensation grants, which we've heard a lot about today, and then improving childcare subsidy rates as well. Next slide. So the proposal to kind of address this huge funding cliff that is looming in December is a $300 million one-time investment to extend the compensation part of the stabilization grants through June of 2025. You can see on this graphic here, you know, the scale of the cliff we're facing. It's huge. So, you know, as other people have already illustrated, and I won't repeat, you know, these grants have really kept the industry afloat. I think that everyone on this call knows it's not good business practice to give someone a raise and take it away. We fully anticipate that there will be a mass exodus of teachers if this funding ends and we don't have another way to support our teachers. And that is a really scary situation, not just for the teachers themselves, but the providers, but also for all of the families who would now have an even harder time finding and affording care. Next slide. So the other policy that Elizabeth and others have talked about today already is improving the reimbursement rates for our childcare subsidy system. The current rates are they're outdated, they're inadequate, they're inequitable. From county to county, there are huge differences. So the proposal that we think would help to address this would be to increase the rate for everybody in the first place, but also establish a statewide floor so that no county is receiving a lower rate than the statewide average. So counties like Mecklenburg, which, you know, the reimbursement rate in Mecklenburg is already higher than that, that statewide rate, you would be held harmless. But think of all of the smaller counties that surround Mecklenburg, where a lot of Mecklenburg County employees actually live. Those counties would be hugely impacted by higher subsidy rates with a statewide floor, which would really improve access, especially for low-income working families. The situation as it stands right now is basically programs who accept subsidy services who offer that are losing money for serving the children of low-income families. So, you know, there's been some incremental changes that legislators have put in place in the last few years, but we're still far behind. It's 2023. We're still using a 2018 market rate level. We've got to get that up. So we know more is needed, especially now with inflation, and just really we need more to meet the needs of our communities. Next slide. So what can we do about all of these problems? I like to think of advocacy as sort of a spectrum. So whether you have already been involved and you're talking to legislators, you're writing op-eds, or you've never really considered yourself an advocate, there's a place for you to get involved because this is impacting everybody. So the most important thing that you can do is to contact your legislators. There is a lot of bipartisan support in the North Carolina General Assembly right now for childcare. We're seeing more support, more attention on childcare than we've ever seen. There have been multiple bipartisan bills introduced in the House and the Senate, including bills about the compensation grants and the subsidy rates with bipartisan sponsors, but those policies have yet to come to fruition, and that funding wasn't included in the House budget. So we really have to make an effort to continue to build that support from legislators so that we can get that funding in the Senate budget and in the final budget. You can reach out to your legislators, you can write a letter, you could do a sign-on letter from businesses in the area and deliver them to legislators. The media is another great way to get involved in advocacy. It's very public. You know, business leaders are a very respected voice in the community. So you could consider writing a letter to the editor or an op-ed. And then, you know, on sort of the lower end of the impact scale, but still really important, you know, just speak up about childcare. Bring public attention to these issues whenever you can. So in meetings, if you're speaking at a conference or as part of a panel, you know, I think that the more people who are talking about childcare, the better, because it's often thought about as just an issue that's impacting parents with young children, but we know that that is not true. Another thing you can do is support your employees in their efforts to advocate. And most importantly, just stay engaged, stay connected. It's wonderful that you're all here today. And we want everyone to leave here with the knowledge that they can do something about this. This legislative session is far from over. The next few weeks and months are really, really critical to make sure that we still, that we get this funding into the final budget. Next slide. So I just want to point out, and I know that Tonya will share all of this information with you later, so no need to like write this down. But here are a few of the key legislators for early childhood issues from, you know, your region, but also some of the larger urban counties. So these folks are, you know, they sit on key committees, they're budget writers, they're in the leadership. And so just, you know, as you're thinking about sort of who to reach out to, you know, take a look at this list and maybe consider building a relationship with these folks if you don't already have one. Next slide. And lastly, you know, we don't want to leave you hanging. You're not on your own trying to do all of this. There are a lot of statewide organizations like ours who are working on this issue. And we have a lot of tools to support you in your efforts. So we have an action center that you can sign up for, and you'll get an alert if it's time to pick up the phone and make a call. It's time to send an email when something's really important is happening. We have a lot of advocacy toolkits with talking points, emails, templates. We have fact sheets if you want to kind of dig more into the nitty gritty of the policies. And of course, we've got contact information for policymakers and just a ton of other resources and information. So our website is here. You can also reach out to me. I know my contact info is in the next slide. So when Tonya shares out the information, feel free to reach out. We would love to help you be a really strong advocate for childcare. And with that, I believe I'm handing it back to Tonya.
Yes, thank you everyone for your stories and just the pertinent information about why we're in such crisis now. When we were practicing for this last week, and Joe revealed that he's got young kids too, and Lionel's like, we should see who on our call actually is dealing with this crisis. And when everybody put their hands, when not everybody, but when so many people on this call showed by a show of hands how they're also struggling with this, it just really hits home about how this doesn't matter what income level you are. This is a crisis that's infecting the entire state. So with that, we have a few minutes left for questions. And so our first question, if you have other questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. But our first question was, for Elizabeth, can you explain a bit more about how the non-COVID specific public funding for childcare is used, especially in how much can help compensate staff, and what else is the public funding paying for? I know it's like several questions, but.
No, that's a great question. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Tonya. And after I'm done, please, my other colleagues who live in this world with me, feel free to chime in if I miss anything. So the best sort of top line message, which is not necessarily a very positive one, is that right now, North Carolina, in terms of state funding, it's less than 1% per year from the state of North Carolina to invest in early education. And that is sort of that slide that we have with the graph that shows that less than 1%. I just did the math based on the House budget, and it is definitely below the 1% threshold. We did see, although we saw some increase in state funding for childcare, we are still not anywhere close to where we need to be. In terms of what sort of programs, specific things that are spent by that state funding, historically, a lot of it is actually sort of required match funding for some of the federal funding that we receive. A lot of that goes to childcare subsidy. Some of it is match funding for TANF, temporary age, needy families. In terms of very state funded programs, specifically Smart Start receives state funding every year, and we have seen some incremental increases. In the House budget, for example, we saw an increase of $5 million per year for this biennium. We also did see sort of a step in the right direction, though much more work to be done, of state funding specifically for the subsidy reimbursement rate, which to my knowledge is one of the first times, if not the first time, we've seen an additional pot of state funding. A lot of the subsidy rate increases have been paid for by the federal funds we receive, and then a sort of match maintenance of effort funds from the state. We also see the majority of the small amount of state funding going to NC PreK. A lot of that does come from the education lottery receipts, but also there is some sort of general funds. So to the question about compensation, there is no specific line item from the state that pays for compensation. That is why that has been on sort of the advocates' ongoing agenda, both sort of temporarily extending the compensation grants, but also working to get additional funding to expand the wages salary supplement program to all 100 counties. So I think it is a space I like to think that there is some creativity and innovation of how do we make it known that compensation and sort of supporting our workforce in childcare is just as important as paying for the infrastructure of a program or the reimbursement rates. But we historically don't have a lot of state investment, and where we do have it, it's really sort of what is required and not a lot extra. I will drop a couple links in the chat again. One, I had shared this earlier, but our fact sheet we developed last year at NC Child goes into sort of the 4 main childcare programs and the breakdown between state and federal funding. as well as the eligible population for those programs and who is currently being served. So that kind of shows you, again, just state funding is not kind of probably where it needs to be, and we have a long journey ahead of us to get that up. And then the next, we did a summary of the House budget that Elaine talked through, and again, disappointing to see not a robust sort of, coming out to support all the needs in childcare, and we're grateful for some of those increases. And so I'll drop that as well, and folks can read through some of the childcare details specifically in the House budget.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I want to get a chance also to address, Jen had a question about, are there discussions at the federal or local level to incentivize businesses with tax credits to provide subsidies? Is that on the table?
I can jump in here. I don't think it's something that there's a lot of conversation about in North Carolina right now, and not particularly at the federal level. I think at the federal level, there's been a lot of focus on some sort of broader changes to how we finance childcare in the country. What I wanted to say is that, North Carolina is doing some pretty innovative work. There's a pilot program that was had bipartisan sponsorship. It was a bill, and it was included in the House budget to establish a pilot for a program known as Trishare, which essentially splits the cost of childcare 3 ways between the state, the parent, and business. And so it's a really interesting approach. I don't think anyone thinks it's like the silver bullet that's going to solve childcare for everybody, but for businesses that are able to participate, for parents and employees who are eligible, it could be a really exciting model. So we're interested to see how that pilot kind of turns out. It's a three-year, 3-county pilot if it ends up in the final budget. But I saw one other question right above that in the chat, which is sort of what happens in June of 2025, like, do we review? And, I think that our response to this is, we know we can't just keep asking for an extension of this compensation grants forever, right? So I think that, what we're saying is that this is a critical moment. Like, this funding is ending, and we will see the collapse of our system. So we don't have time to debate what happens in 2025. We have to stop the bleeding. And in the next 2 years, we look at more innovative approaches like Trishare and other pilots. We look at expanding the childcare wages program statewide, so that we can continue to support compensation in other ways. We improve subsidy rates, which helps providers and parents and teachers. So, we think it's sort of a both and approach. That large investment is a one-time investment, and it's critically needed. And we still have to be building up our system and exploring other options while we are doing that.
All right. Thank you so much, Elaine, for that. We are right at time, so let me close this out. So if anybody wants to stay on, Janet, you can definitely talk to them. But I wanted to close this out, thanking everybody for participating. We have recorded this, and we will also send out follow-up materials along with this PowerPoint. Somebody from Smart Start put in some information about the wages program, which pays bonuses. So we'll grab a fact sheet on that as well that we can send out with our follow-up materials too. So I did just want to thank everybody for participating. And I know some people do have to jump. So thank you very much for those of you. And for those of you who want to hang on and ask other questions or talk to some of the other panelists, feel free to, but our portion of it is officially over. So thank you all so much to all of our speakers and panelists as well. Go ahead, Janet, I'll unmute you.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that, we are in the midst of a study about how to alternatively finance childcare, and particularly alternate rate methodology for childcare subsidy. And within that conversation, there's what is quality childcare, and how do we fund it sufficiently so that all families have access to it. So over the next year, I see innovation. There was just a meeting last week to talk about this, so that we can have a subsidy rate methodology that better affords high quality childcare for all families who need it. And that is, innovation that right now I think North Carolina is leading, because very few states have changed the way they finance childcare subsidy.
All right, were there any other questions that people had that they wanted to pop in and ask, or that we didn't address? I think Elaine.
Hey, Tonya, I have a quick one real quick. Hey, Janet, awesome to see you today, everybody. How is summer care included in this conversation, or is summer care for school-aged children even a part of this mix? Because I think while we've graduated from daycare, we're in the summer camp fiasco now with insanely rising costs and lack of counselors and shortened programs and all of that. So it's like a Gen 2 issue, right? And so does that factor into any of what we're talking about today?
Well, licensed childcare goes up through the age of 12. And so many childcare programs, both family childcare homes and childcare centers, serve school-age children. There are, and the schools, of course, in Mecklenburg County have, it's the ASAP program. So summer care is not required to be licensed. So that which is not licensed is not really part of the same conversation. But that portion of the system that is licensed is part of this conversation. And with regard to shortages, I think you see shortages within licensed childcare and within license exempt summer childcare programs.
Madison asked about after school. Hey, Tim, you want to jump in on that one, or are you she asked about after school? Madison, what's your specific question about after school? Oh, you're muted if you're trying to talk, Madison. Wonder if there are any programs for graduating high school seniors to help with staff summer programs. Tim, you can answer that one.
I don't know as well off the top of my head in terms of how the county handles those things at Park and Rec, and for their summer camp programs and their other summer programming. I'd have to follow up and confirm.
Gotcha.
I could take the Madison question. Care for children in, school age, childcare goes up through age 12. So most licensed childcare programs, many licensed childcare programs serve children birth to 5 and have a school age component, whether it's before and after school and or summer. Summer care does not need to be licensed. Care for under 4 hours per day does not need to be licensed. And so school age childcare can be license exempt, but in order to participate in the childcare subsidy program must be licensed. So it's a both and. There are license exempt school age programs and there are licensed school age childcare programs.
You have a question, Rhonda, or you wanted to chime in?
I just wanted to make one quick comment, Tonya. I wanted to lift something up that Elaine said earlier. I just wanted to stress once again, I know the providers on the call know this, but for those of you that are part of the business community, teachers are already asking questions and concerned because they know this money is running out at the end of the year. What Elaine said is real. I don't know if that alarms anyone or concerns you the way it concerns us. But there will be a major exit strategy at the end of the year if we don't identify this. So I just want to say that I'm very much about being proactive and not reactive. And that will be a crisis like we've never seen before. So it is a major issue. So I just wanted to emphasize that. We know that because it's already a struggle, but if we don't put our resources together and get really creative about this work and considering what that would look like, it really could be a mass exodus at the end of the year, and they would not have trouble finding anything to meet the salaries that they have at this point, which would be a major problem for our communities.
All right, I think on that serious note, thank you for reiterating that, Rhonda. I'm going to close this out. Thank you all once again for participating. And as I said, we'll send follow-up materials before the end of the week. So thank you all very much.